reply, only the clanging of the bell. And then my curiosity overcame my fear, and with a quick movement I threw open the door. "Are you satisfied now?" I said angrily. But I addressed an empty vestibule. There was absolutely no one there, and then I sat down on the mat and laughed. I never was so glad to see no one in my life, but my laugh was short-lived. What made the bell ring? I suddenly asked myself, and then the feeling of fear came upon me again. I gathered my somewhat shattered self together, sprang to my feet, slammed the door with such force that the corridors echoed to the sound, slid the bolt once more, turned the key, moved a heavy chair in front of it, and then fled like a frightened hare to the sideboard in my dining room. There I grasped the decanter holding my whiskey, seized a glass from the shelf, and started to pour out the usual dram, when the glass fell from my hand and was shivered into 1,000 pieces on the hardwood floor. For as I poured, I glanced through the open door, and there in my sanctum the flicker of a random flame divulged the form of a being, the eyes of whom seemed fixed on mine, piercing me through and through. To say that I was petrified but dimly expresses the situation. I was granitized, and so I remained until by a more luminous flicker from the burning wood, I perceived that the being wore a flaring red necktie. He is a human, I thought, and with the thought the tension of my nervous system relaxed, and I was able to feel a sufficiently well-developed sense of indignation to demand an explanation. "This is a mighty cool proceeding on your part," I said, leaving the sideboard and walking into the sanctum. "Yes," he replied in a tone that made me jump. It was so extremely sepulchral, a tone that seemed as if it might have been acquired in a damp corner of some cave off the earth. "But it's a cool evening." "I wonder that a man of your coolness doesn't hire himself out to some refrigerating company," I remarked with a sneer which would have delighted the soul of Cassius himself. "I've thought about it," returned the being calmly, "but never went any further. Summer hotel proprietors have always outbid the refrigerating people, and they in turn have been laid low by millionaires, who have hired me on occasion to freeze out people they didn't like, but who have persisted in calling. I must confess, though, my dear Hiram, that you are not much warmer yourself. This greeting is hardly what I expected." "Well, if you want to make me warmer," I retorted hotly, "just keep on calling me Hiram. How the deuce did you know of that blot on my escutcheon anyhow?" I added, for Hiram was one of the crimes of my family that I had tried to conceal, my parents having fastened the name of Hiram Spencer Carrington upon me at baptism, for no reason other than that my rich bachelor uncle, who subsequently failed and became a charge upon me, was so named. "I was standing at the door of the church when you were baptized," returned the visitor, "and as you were an interesting baby, I have kept an eye on you ever since. Of course I knew that you discarded Hiram as soon as you got old enough to put away childish things. And since the failure of your uncle, I have been aware that you desired to be known as Spencer Carrington. But to me, you are, always have been, and always will be, Hiram." "Well, don't give it away," I pleaded. "I hope to be famous someday. And if the American newspaper paragrapher ever got a hold of the fact that once in my life I was Hiram, I'd have to hire him to let me alone." "That's a bad joke, Hiram," said the visitor, "and for that reason I like it, though I don't laugh. There is no danger of your becoming famous if you stick to humor of that sort." "Well, I'd like to know," I put in, my anger returned. "I'd like to know who in Brindisi you are, what in Cairo you want, and what in the name of the 17 hinges of the gates of Singapore you are doing here at this time of night." "When you were a baby, Hiram, you had blue eyes," said my visitor. "Bonny blue eyes, as the poet says." "What of it?" I asked. "This," replied my visitor. If you have them now, you can very easily see what I am doing here. I am sitting down and talking to you." "Oh, are you?" I said with fine scorn. I had not observed that. The fact is, my eyes were so weakened by the brilliance of that necktie of yours that I doubt I could see anything, not even one of my own jokes. It's a scorcher, that tie of yours. In fact, I never saw anything so red in my life. "I do not see why you complain of my tie," said the visitor. "Your own is just as bad." "Blue is never so withering as red," I retorted, at the same time caressing the scarf I wore. "Perhaps not, but if you will look in the glass, Hiram, you will observe that your point is not well taken," said my vis-a-vis calmly. I acted upon the suggestion and looked upon my reflection in the glass, lighting a match to facilitate the operation. I was horrified to observe that my beautiful blue tie, of which I was so proud, had in some manner changed, and was now of the same aggressive hue as was that of my visitor, red even as a brick is red. To grasp it firmly in my hands and tear it from my neck was the work of the moment, and then in a spirit of rage I turned upon my companion. "See here," I cried, "I've had quite enough of you. I can't make you out, and I can't say that I want to. You know where the door is. You will oblige me by putting it to its proper use." "Sit down, Hiram," said he, "and don't be foolish and ungrateful. You are behaving in a most extraordinary fashion, destroying your clothing and acting like a madman generally. What was the use of ripping up a handsome tie like that?" "I despise loud hues. Red is a jockey's color," I answered. "But you did not destroy the red tie," he said with a smile. "You tore up your blue one. Look, there it is on the floor. The red one you still have on." Investigation showed the truth of my visitor's assertion. That flaunting streamer of anarchy still made my neck infamous, and before me, on the floor, an almost unrecognizable mass of shreds, lay my cherished cerulean tie. The revelation stunned me. Tears came into my eyes, and trickling down over my cheeks, fairly hissed with the feverish heat of my flesh. My muscles relaxed, and I fell limp into my chair. "You need stimulant," said my visitor kindly. "Go take a drop of your old reserve, and then come back here to me. I've something to say to you." "Will you join me?" I asked faintly. "No," returned the visitor. "I am so fond of whiskey that I never molest it. That act which is your stimulant is death to the rye. Never realized that, did you?" "No, I never did," I said meekly. "And yet you claim to love it." "Bah!" he said. And then I obeyed his command, drained my glass to the dregs, and returned. "What is your mission?" I asked, when I had made myself as comfortable as was possible under the circumstances. "To relieve you of your woes," he said. "You are a homeopath, I observe," said I with a sneer. "You are a homeopath in theory and an allopath in practice." "I am not usually unintelligent," said he. "I fail to comprehend your meaning. Perhaps you express yourself badly." "I wish you'd express yourself for Zululand," I retorted hotly. "What I mean is, you believe in the similia similibus business, but you prescribe large doses. I don't believe troubles like mine can be cured on your plan. A man can't get rid of his stock by adding to it." "Ah, I see. You think I have added to your troubles." "I don't think so," I answered with a fond glance at my ruined tie. "I know so." "Well, wait until I have laid my plan before you and see if you won't change your mind," said my visitor significantly. "All right," I said. "Proceed. Only hurry. I go to bed early as a rule, and it's getting quite early now." "It's only 1 o'clock," said the visitor, ignoring the sarcasm. "But I will hasten, as I've several other calls to make before breakfast." "Are you a milkman?" I asked. "You are flippant," he replied. "But, Hiram," he added, "I have come here to aid you in spite of your unworthiness. You want to know what to provide for your club night on the 15th. You want something that will knock the martyr's night silly." "Not exactly that," I replied. "I don't want anything so abominably good as to make all the other things I've done seem failures. That is not good business. Would you like to be hailed as the discoverer of genius? Would you like to be the responsible agent for the greatest exhibition of skill in a certain direction ever seen? Would you like to become the most famous impresario the world has ever known?" "Now," I said, forgetting my dignity under the enthusiasm with which I was inspired by my visitor's words, and infected more or less with his undoubtedly magnetic spirit. "Now you're shouting." "I thought so, Hiram. I thought so. And that's why I am here. I saw you on Wall Street today and read your difficulty at once in your eyes, and I resolved to help you. I am a magician, and 1 or 2 little things have happened of late to make me wish to prestidigitate in public. I knew you were after a show of some kind, and I've come to offer you my services." "Oh, pshaw," I said. "The members of the Gutenberg Club are men of brains, not children. Card tricks are hackneyed, and sleight of hand shows Paul." "Do they indeed?" said the visitor. "Well, mine won't. If you don't believe it, I'll prove to you what I can do." "I have no paraphernalia," I said. "Well, I have," said he, and as he spoke, a pack of cards seemed to grow out of my hands. I must have turned pale at this unexpected happening, for my visitor smiled and said, "Don't be frightened. That's only one of my tricks. Now choose a card," he added, "and when you have done so, toss the pack in the air. Don't tell me what the card is. It alone will fall to the floor." "Nonsense," said I. "It's impossible." "Do as I tell you." I did as he told me, to a degree only. I tossed the cards in the air without choosing one, although I made a feint of doing so. Not a card fell back on the floor. They every one disappeared from view in the ceiling. If it had not been for the heavy chair I had rolled in front of the door, I think I should have fled. "How's that for a trick?" asked my visitor. I said nothing, for the very good reason that my words stuck in my throat. "Give me a little creme de menthe, will you please?" said he after a moment's pause. "I haven't a drop in the house," I said, relieved to think that this wonderful being could come down to anything so earthly. "Pshaw, Hiram," he ejaculated, apparently in disgust. "Don't be mean, and above all, don't lie. Why, man, you've got a bottle full of it in your hand. Do you want it all?" He was right. Where it came from I do not know, but beyond question the graceful slim-necked bottle was in my right hand, and my left held a liqueur glass of exquisite form. "Say," I gasped, as soon as I was able to collect my thoughts, "what are your terms?" "Wait a moment," he answered. "Let me do a little mind reading before we arrange preliminaries." "I haven't much of a mind to read tonight," I answered wildly. "You're right there," said he. "It's like a dime novel, that mind of yours tonight. But I'll do the best I can with it. Suppose you think of your favorite poem, and after turning it over in your mind carefully for a few minutes, select 2 lines from it, concealing them, of course, from me, and I will tell you what they are." Now, my favorite poem, I regret to say, is Lewis Carroll's Jabberwock, a fact I was ashamed to confess to an utter stranger, so I tried to deceive him by thinking of some other lines. The effort was hardly successful, For the only other lines I could call to mind at the moment were from Rudyard Kipling's rhyme, The Post That Fitted, and which ran, "Year by year, in pious patience, vengeful Mrs. Boffin sits, waiting for the Sleary babies to develop Sleary's fits." "Humph!" ejaculated my visitor. "You're a great Hiram, you are." And then, rising from his chair and walking to my poet's corner, the magician selected 2 volumes. "There," said he, handing me the departmental ditties, "you'll find the lines you tried to fool me with at the foot of page 13. Look." I looked, and there lay that vile Sleary sentiment in all the majesty of type, staring me in the eyes. "And here," added my visitor, opening through the looking glass, "here is the poem that to your mind holds all the philosophy of life." "Come to my arms, my beamish boy," he chortled in his joy. I blushed and trembled, blushed that he should discover the weakness of my taste, trembled at his power. "I don't blame you for coloring," said the magician, "but I thought you said the Gutenberg was made up of men of brains. Do you think you could stay on the rolls a month if they were aware that your poetic ideals are summed up in the Jabberwock and Sleary fits?" "My taste might be far worse," I answered. "Yes, it might. You have stooped to liking some of your own verses. I ought really to congratulate you, I suppose," retorted the visitor with a sneering laugh. This roused my ire again. "Who are you, anyhow, that you come here and take me to task?" I demanded angrily. "I'll like anything I please, and without asking your permission. If I cared more for the Peterkin papers than I do for Shakespeare, I wouldn't be accountable to you, and that's all there is about it." "Never mind who I am," said the visitor. "Suffice to say that I am myself. You'll know my name soon enough. In fact, you will pronounce it involuntarily the first thing when you wake in the morning, and then—" Here he shook his head ominously, and I felt myself grow rigid with fright in my chair. "Now, for the final trick," he said, after a moment's pause. "Think of where you would most like to be at this moment, and I'll exert my power to put you there. Only close your eyes first." I closed my eyes and wished. When I opened them, I was in the billiard room of the Gutenberg Club with Perkins and Thompson. "For heaven's sake, Spencer," they said in surprise, "where did you drop in from? Why, man, you're as white as a sheet. And what a necktie! Take it off." "Grab hold of me, boys, and hold me fast," I pleaded, falling on my knees in terror. "If you don't, I believe I'll die." The idea of returning to my sanctum was intolerably dreadful to me. "Ha ha!" laughed the magician, for even as I spoke to Perkins and Thompson, I found myself seated opposite my infernal visitor in my room once more. "They couldn't keep you an instant with me summoning you back." His laughter was terrible. His frown was pleasanter, and I felt myself gradually losing control of my senses. "Go," I cried, "leave me, or you will have the crime of murder on your conscience." "I have no he began, but I heard no more. That is the last I remember of that fearful night. I must have fainted, and then have fallen into a deep slumber. When I waked it was morning, and I was alone, but undressed and in bed, unconscionably weak, and surrounded by medicine bottles of many kinds. The clock on the mantel on the other side of the room indicated that it was after 10 o'clock. "Great Beelzebub!" I cried, taking note of the hour. "I've an engagement with Barlow at 9. And then a sweet-faced woman, who I afterwards learned was a professional nurse, entered the room, and within an hour I realized 2 facts. One was that I had lain ill for many days, and that my engagement with Barlow was now for 6 weeks unfulfilled. The other, that my midnight visitor was none other than, and yet I don't know. His tricks certainly were worthy of that individual, but Perkins and Thompson asserted that I never entered the club that night, and surely if my visitor was Beelzebub himself, he would not have omitted so important a factor of success as my actual presence in the billiard room on that occasion would have been. And besides, he was altogether too cool to have come from his reputed residence. Altogether, I think the episode most unaccountable, particularly when I reflect that while no trace of my visitor was discoverable in my room the next morning, as my nurse tells me, my blue necktie was in reality found upon the floor, crushed and torn into a shapeless bundle of frayed rags. As for the club entertainment, I am told that, despite my absence, it was a wonderful success, redeemed from failure, the treasurer of the club said, by the voluntary services of a guest, who secured admittance on one of my cards, and who executed some sleight-of-hand tricks that made the members tremble, and whose mind-reading feats performed on the club's butler not only made it necessary for him to resign his office, but disclosed to the House Committee the whereabouts of several cases of rare wines that had mysteriously disappeared. The end. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe our channel for more stories. Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy our narrated stories. Sedibus ut soltem placidis in morte quiscam. Virgil. In relating the circumstances which have led to my confinement within this refuge for the demented, I am aware that my present position will create a natural doubt of the authenticity of my narrative. It is an unfortunate fact that the bulk of humanity is too limited in its mental vision to weigh with patience and intelligence those isolated phenomena, seen and felt only by a psychologically sensitive few, which lie outside its common experience. Men of broader intellect know that there is no sharp distinction betwixt the real and the unreal, that all things appear as they do only by virtue of the delicate individual physical and mental media through which we are made conscious of them. But the prosaic materialism of the majority condemns as madness the flashes of supersight, which penetrate the common veil of obvious empiricism. My name is Jervis Dudley, and from earliest childhood I have been a dreamer and a visionary. Wealthy beyond the necessity of a commercial life and temperamentally unfitted for the formal studies and social recreations of my acquaintances, I have dwelt ever in realms apart from the visible world, spending my youth and adolescence in ancient and little-known books, and in roaming the fields and groves of the region near my ancestral home. I do not think that what I read in these books or saw in these fields and groves was exactly what other boys read and saw there. But of this I must say little, since detailed speech would but confirm those cruel slanders upon my intellect which I sometimes overhear from the whispers of the stealthy attendants around me. It is sufficient for me to relate events without analyzing causes. I have said that I dwelt apart from the visible world, but I have not said that I dwelt alone. This no human creature may do, for lacking the fellowship of the living, he inevitably draws upon the companionship of things that are not, or are no longer, living. Close to my home there lies a singular wooded hollow, in whose twilight deeps I spent most of my time, reading, thinking, and dreaming. Down its moss-covered slopes my first steps of infancy were taken, and around its grotesquely gnarled oak trees my first fancies of boyhood were woven. Well did I come to know the presiding dryads of those trees, and often have I watched their wild dances in the struggling beams of waning moon. But of these things I must not now speak. I will tell only of the lone tomb in the darkest of the hillside thickets. The deserted tomb of the Hydes, an old and exalted family whose last direct descendant had been laid within its black recesses many decades before my birth. The vault to which I refer is an ancient granite, weathered and discolored by the mists and dampness of generations. Excavated back into the hillside, the structure is visible only at the entrance. The door, a ponderous and forbidding slab of stone, hangs upon rusted iron hinges and is fastened ajar, in a queerly sinister way, by means of heavy iron chains and padlocks, according to a gruesome fashion of half a century ago. The abode of the race, whose scions are inurned, had once crowned the declivity which holds the tomb, but had long since fallen victim to the flames which sprang up from a disastrous stroke of lightning. Of the midnight storm which destroyed this gloomy mansion, the older inhabitants of the region sometimes speak in hushed and uneasy voices, alluding to what they call divine wrath, in a manner that in later years vaguely increased the always strong fascination which I felt for the forest-darkened sepulchre. One man only had perished in the fire. When the last of the Hydes was buried in this place of shade and stillness, the sad urnful of ashes had come from a distant land, to which the family had repaired when the mansion burned down. No one remains to lay flowers before the granite portal, and few care to brave the depressing shadows which seem to linger strangely about the water-worn stones. I shall never forget the afternoon when first I stumbled upon the half-hidden house of the dead. It was in midsummer, when the alchemy of nature transmutes the sylvan landscape to one vivid and almost homogeneous mass of green, when the senses are well nigh intoxicated with the surging seas of moist verdure and the subtly indefinable odors of the soil and the vegetation. In such surroundings, the mind loses its perspective. Time and space become trivial and unreal, and echoes of a forgotten prehistoric past beat insistently upon the enthralled consciousness. All day, I had been wandering through the mystic groves of the hollow, thinking thoughts I need not discuss and conversing with things I need not name. In years a child of 10, I had seen and heard many wonders unknown to the throng, and was oddly aged in certain respects. When, upon forcing my way between two savage clumps of briars, I suddenly encountered the entrance of the vault, I had no knowledge of what I had discovered. The dark blocks of granite, the door so curiously ajar, and the funereal carvings above the arch aroused in me no associations of mournful or terrible character. Of graves and tombs I knew and imagined much, but had, on account of my peculiar temperament, been kept from all personal contact with churchyards and cemeteries. The strange stone house on the woodland slope was to me only a source of interest and speculation, and its cold, damp interior, into which I vainly peered through the aperture so tantalizingly left, contained for me no hint of death or decay. But in that instant of curiosity was born the madly unreasoning desire which has brought me to this hell of confinement. Spurred on by a voice which must have come from the hideous soul of the forest, I resolved to enter the beckoning gloom in spite of the ponderous chains which barred my passage. In the waning light of day, I alternately rattled the rusty impediments with a view to throwing wide the stone door, and essayed to squeeze my slight form through the space already provided. But neither plan met with success. At first curious, I was not frantic, and when in the thickening twilight I returned to my home, I had sworn to the 100 gods of the grove that at any cost I would someday force an entrance to the black, chilly depths that seemed calling out to me. The physician with the iron-gray beard who comes each day to my room once told a visitor that this decision marked the beginnings of a pitiful monomania. But I will leave final judgment to my readers when they shall have learned all. The months following my discovery were spent in futile attempts to force the complicated padlock of the slightly open vault, and in carefully guarded inquiries regarding the nature and history of the structure. With the traditionally receptive ears of the small boy, I learned much, though an habitual secretiveness caused me to tell no one of my information or my resolve. It is perhaps worth mentioning that I was not at all surprised or terrified on learning of the nature of the vault. My rather original ideas regarding life and death had caused me to associate the cold clay with the breathing body in a vague fashion, and I felt that the great sinister family of the burned-down mansion was in some way represented within the stone space I sought to explore. Mumbled tales of the weird rites and godless revels of bygone years in the ancient hall gave to me a new and potent interest in the tomb, before whose door I would sit for hours at a time each day. Once I thrust a candle within the nearly closed entrance, but could see nothing save a flight of damp stone steps leading downward. The odor of the place repelled yet bewitched me. I felt I had known it before, in a past remote beyond all recollection, beyond even my tenancy of the body I now possess. The year after I first beheld the tomb, I stumbled upon a worm-eaten translation of Plutarch's Lives in the book-filled attic of my home. Reading the life of Theseus, I was much impressed by that passage telling of the great stone beneath which the boyish hero was to find his tokens of destiny, whenever he should become old enough to lift its enormous weight. This legend had the effect of dispelling my keenest impatience to enter the vault, for it made me feel that the time was not yet ripe. Later, I told myself, I should grow to a strength and ingenuity which might enable me to unfasten the heavily chained door with ease. But until then, I would do better by conforming to what seemed the will of fate. Accordingly, my watches by the dank portal became less persistent, and much of my time was spent in other, though equally strange, pursuits. I would sometimes rise very quietly in the night, stealing out to walk in those churchyards and places of burial from which I had been kept by my parents. What I did there I may not say, for I am not now sure of the reality of certain things. But I know that on the day after such a nocturnal ramble, I would often astonish those about me with my knowledge of topics almost forgotten for many generations. It was after a night like this that I shocked the community with a queer conceit about the burial of the rich and celebrated Squire Brewster, a maker of local history who was interred in 1711, and whose slate headstone, bearing a graven skull and crossbones, was slowly crumbling to powder. In a moment of childish imagination, I vowed not only that the undertaker, Goodman Simpson, had stolen the silver-buckled shoes, silken hose, and satin small-clothes of the deceased before burial, but that the squire himself, not fully inanimate, had turned twice in his mound-covered coffin on the day of interment. But the idea of entering the tomb never left my thoughts, being indeed stimulated by the unexpected genealogical discovery that my own maternal ancestry possessed at least a slight link with the supposedly extinct family of the Hydes. Last of my paternal race, I was likewise the last of this older and more mysterious line. I began to feel that the tomb was mine, and to look forward with hot eagerness to the time when I might pass within that stone door and down those slimy stone steps in the dark. I now formed the habit of listening very intently at the slightly open portal, choosing my favorite hours of midnight stillness for the odd vigil. By the time I came of age, I had made a small clearing in the thicket before the mold-stained facade of the hillside, allowing the surrounding vegetation to encircle and overhang the space like the walls and roof of a sylvan bower. This bower was my temple, the fastened door my shrine, and here I would lie outstretched on the mossy ground, thinking strange thoughts and dreaming of strange dreams. The night of the first revelation was a sultry one. I must have fallen asleep from fatigue, for it was with a distinct sense of awakening that I heard the voices. Of those tones and accents I hesitate to speak, of their quality I will not speak, but I may say that they presented certain uncanny differences in vocabulary, pronunciation, and mode of utterance. Every shade of New England dialect, from the uncouth syllables of the Puritan colonists to the precise rhetoric 50 years ago, seemed represented in that shadowy colloquy, though it was only later that I noticed the fact. At the time, indeed, my attention was distracted from this matter by another phenomenon, a phenomenon so fleeting that I could not take oath upon its reality. I barely fancied that, as I awoke, a light had been hurriedly extinguished within the sunken sepulchre. I do not think I was either astounded or panic-stricken, but I know that I was greatly and permanently changed that night. Upon returning home, I went with much directness to a rotting chest in the attic, wherein I found the key which, next day, unlocked with ease the barrier I had so long stormed in vain. It was in the soft glow of late afternoon that I first entered the vault on the abandoned slope. A spell was upon me, and my heart leapt with an exultation I can but ill describe. As I closed the door behind me and descended the dripping steps by the light of my lone candle, I seemed to know the way. And though the candle sputtered with the stifling reek of the place, I felt singularly at home in the musty, charnel house air. Looking about me, I beheld many marble slabs bearing coffins, or the remains of coffins. Some of these were sealed and intact, but others had nearly vanished, leaving the silver handles and plates isolated amidst certain curious heaps of whitish dust. Upon one plate, I read the name of Sir Geoffrey Hyde, who had come from Sussex in 1640 and died here a few years later. In a conspicuous alcove was one fairly well-preserved and untenanted casket, adorned with a single name which brought me both a smile and a shudder. An odd impulse caused me to climb upon the broad slab, extinguish my candle, and lie down within the vacant box. In the grey light of dawn, I staggered from the vault and locked the chain of the door behind me. I was no longer a young man, though but 21 winters had chilled my bodily frame. Early rising villagers who observed my homeward progress looked at me strangely, and marveled at the signs of ribald revelry which they saw in one whose life was known to be sober and solitary. I did not appear before my parents till after a long and refreshing sleep. Henceforth, I haunted the tomb each night, seeing, hearing, and doing things I must never reveal. My speech, always susceptible to environmental influences, was the first thing to succumb to the change, and my suddenly acquired archaism of diction was soon remarked upon. Later, a queer boldness and recklessness came into my demeanor till I unconsciously grew to possess the bearing of a man of the world, despite my lifelong seclusion. My formerly silent tongue waxed voluble with the easy grace of a Chesterfield or the godless cynicism of a Rochester. I displayed a peculiar erudition, utterly unlike the fantastic, monkish lore over which I had pored in youth, and covered the fly-leaves of my books with facile impromptu epigrams which brought up suggestions of Gay, Prior, and the sprightliest of Augustan wits and rhymesters. One morning at breakfast I came close to disaster by declaiming in palpably licorice accents an effusion of 18th-century bacchanalian mirth, a bit of Georgian playfulness never recorded in a book. It read something like this. Come hither, my lads, with your tankards of ale, and drink to the present before it shall fail. Pile each on your platter a mountain of beef, for 'tis eating and drinking that bring us relief. So fill up your glass, so life will soon pass. When you're dead, you'll ne'er drink to your king or your lass. Anacreon had a red nose, so they say, but what's a red nose if you're happy and gay? Gad split me, I'd rather be red whilst I'm here than white as a lily and dead half a year. So Betty, my miss, come give me a kiss, in hell there's no innkeeper's daughter like this. Young Harry, propped up just as straight as he's able, will soon lose his wig and slip under the table, but fill up your goblets and pass 'em around. Better under the table than under the ground. So revel and chaff as ye thirstily quaff. Under 6 feet of dirt 'tis less easy to laugh. The fiend strike me blue, I'm scarce able to walk, and damn me if I can stand upright or talk. Here, landlord, bid Betty to summon a chair, I'll try home for a while, for my wife is not there. So lend me a hand, I'm not able to stand, but I'm gay whilst I linger, on top of the land. About this time I conceived my present fear of fire and thunderstorms. Previously indifferent to such things, I had now an unspeakable horror of them, and would retire to the innermost recesses of the house whenever the heavens threatened an electrical display. A favorite haunt of mine during the day was the ruined cellar of the mansion that had burned down, and in fancy I would picture the structure as it had been in its prime. On one occasion I startled a villager by leading him confidently to a shallow sub-cellar, of whose existence I seemed to know, in spite of the fact that it had been unseen and forgotten for many generations. At last came that which I had long feared. My parents, alarmed at the altered manner and appearance of their only son, commenced to exert over my movements a kindly espionage which threatened to result in disaster. I had told no one of my visits to the tomb, having guarded my secret purpose with religious zeal since childhood. But now I was forced to exercise care in threading the mazes of the wooded hollow, that I might throw off a possible pursuer. My key to the vault I kept suspended from a cord around my neck, its presence known only to me. I never carried out of the sepulchre any of the things I came upon whilst within its walls. One morning, as I emerged from the damp tomb and fastened the chain of the portal with none too steady hand, I beheld in an adjacent thicket the dreaded face of a watcher. Surely the end was near, for my bower was discovered, and the objective of my nocturnal journeys revealed. The man did not accost me, so I hastened home in an effort to overhear what he might report to my careworn father. Were my sojourns beyond the chained door about to be proclaimed to the world? Imagine my delighted astonishment on hearing the spy inform my parent in cautious whisper that I had spent the night in the bower outside the tomb. My sleep-filmed eyes fixed upon the crevice where the padlocked portal stood ajar. By what miracle had the watcher been thus deluded? I was now convinced that a supernatural agency protected me. Made bold by this heaven-sent circumstance, I began to resume perfect openness in going to the vault, confident that no one could witness my entrance. For a week I tasted to the full the joys of that charnel conviviality which I must not describe. When the thing happened, and I was borne away to this accursed abode of sorrow and monotony, I should not have ventured out that night, for the taint of thunder was in the clouds, and hellish phosphorescence rose from the rank swamp at the bottom of the hollow. The call of the dead, too, was different. Instead of the hillside tomb, it was the charred cellar on the crest of the slope whose presiding demon beckoned to me with unseen fingers. As I emerged from an intervening grove upon the plain before the ruin, I beheld in the misty moonlight a thing I had always vaguely expected. The mansion, gone for a century, once more reared its stately height to the raptured vision, every window ablaze with the splendor of many candles. Up the long drive rolled the coaches of the Boston gentry, whilst on foot came a numerous assemblage of powdered exquisites from the neighboring mansions. With this throng I mingled, though I knew I belonged with the hosts rather than the guests. Inside the hall were music, laughter, and wine on every hand. Several faces I recognized, though I should have known them better had they been shrivelled or eaten away by death and decomposition. Amidst a wild and reckless throng, I was the wildest and most abandoned. Gay blasphemy poured in torrents from my lips, and in my shocking sallies I heeded no law of God, man, or nature. Suddenly a peal of thunder, resonant even above the din of the swinish revelry, clave the very roof and laid a hush of fear upon the boisterous company. Red tongues of flame and searing gusts of heat engulfed the house, and the roisterers, struck with terror at the descent of a calamity which seemed to transcend the bounds of unguided nature, fled shrieking into the night. I alone remained, riveted to my seat by a groveling fear which I had never felt before. And then a second horror took possession of my soul. Burnt alive to ashes, my body dispersed by the four winds, I might never lie in the tomb of hides. Was not my coffin prepared for me? Had I not a right to rest till eternity amongst the descendants of Sir Geoffrey Hyde? I would claim my heritage of death, even though my soul go seeking through the ages for another corporeal tenement to represent it on that vacant slab in the alcove of the vault. Jervis Hyde should never share the sad fate of Palinurus. As the phantom of the burning house faded, I found myself screaming and struggling madly in the arms of two men, one of whom was the spy who had followed me to the tomb. Rain was pouring down in torrents, and upon the southern horizon were flashes of the lightning that had so lately passed over our heads. My father, his face lined with sorrow, stood by as I shouted my demands to be laid within the tomb, frequently admonishing my captors to treat me gently as they could. A blackened circle on the floor of the ruined cellar told of a violent stroke from the heavens. And from this spot, a group of curious villagers with lanterns were prying a small box of antique workmanship which the thunderbolt had brought to light. Ceasing my futile and now objectless writhing, I watched the spectators as they viewed the treasure trove, and was permitted to share in their discoveries. The box, whose fastenings were broken by the stroke which had unearthed it, contained many papers and objects of value. But I had eyes for one thing alone. It was the porcelain miniature of a young man in a smartly curled bagwig, and bore the initials J.H. The face was such that as I gazed I might as well have been studying my mirror. On the following day I was brought to this room with the barred windows. But I have been kept informed of certain things through an aged and simple-minded servitor, for whom I bore a fondness in infancy, and who, like me, loves the churchyard. What I have dared relate of my experiences within the vault has brought me only pitying smiles. My father, who visits me frequently, declares that at no time did I pass the chained portal, and swears that the rusted padlock had not been touched for 50 years when he examined it. He even says that all the village knew of my journeys to the tomb, and that I was often watched as I slept in the bower outside the grim facade, my half-open eyes fixed on the crevice that leads to the interior. Against these assertions I have no tangible proof to offer, since my key to the padlock was lost in the struggle on that night of horrors. The strange things of the past which I learnt during those nocturnal meetings with the dead he dismisses as the fruits of my lifelong and omnivorous browsing amongst the ancient volumes of the family library. Had it not been for my old servant Hiram, I should have by this time become quite convinced of my madness. But Hiram, loyal to the last, has held faith in me, and has done that which impels me to make public at least a part of my story. A week ago, he burst open the lock which chains the door of the tomb perpetually ajar, and descended with a lantern into the murky depths. On a slab at an alcove he found an old but empty coffin, whose tarnished plate bears the single word, Jervis. In that coffin, and in that vault, they have promised me I shall be buried. The end. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe our channel for more stories.
Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy our narrated stories. There are places where the veil between the known and the unfathomable is perilously thin, and it is in such realms that truths are best left forgotten. Ancient Kashi, now Varanasi, conceals more than history in its name. With dusk settling, the city wraps itself in a twilight shroud. Smoke threads twist through the air, blending with murmured prayers, thickening the atmosphere with an almost tangible sense of mystery. The Ganges River reflects the glimmering lights of ceremonial fires along the Ghats, where the sacred and the profane dance in the curling mists. The pyres, fed by ancient woods, consume the bodies with a reverence that belies the violence of flames. The air is thick with sandalwood and charred offerings, masking the finality of death under sacred rites. In the shallows of the Ganges, silhouetted figures wade with deliberate steps. These men, draped in the sparse cloth of the destitute, are seekers of the dead's forgotten wealth. Their hands, darkened by river silt and ash, sift through the submerged sands, feeling for the cold bite of metal. Gold rings, necklaces, and the occasional coin dropped from the deceased's pockets. Each piece plucked from the holy river's grip is a macabre token of survival, destined to be cleansed, melted down, and sold to adorn the living. Stepping off a narrow boat onto the stone steps, James Montgomery, a British archaeologist, felt as though he had entered a painting, a scene preserved across the ages. Even with his academic accolades, James clung to his skepticism like a knight to his armor, guarding against the intangible. He believed only in what could be touched, measured, seen. Yet Varanasi seemed determined to erode his certainties. His constant companion, a weathered copy of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, betrayed a fascination with the afterlife. A scholarly interest, he insisted, nothing more. His trained eyes sketched and noted details as he walked through the bustling streets. It was early spring of 1932, and the British Raj held sway over India. Political tensions were palpable, with the struggle for independence intensifying across many regions like a storm gathering on the horizon. He had spent years poring over texts and artifacts in the dusty confines of the British Museum. This opportunity for field work was a rare departure from his usual scholarly pursuits, and he was determined to make the most of it. Fluent in Sanskrit and well-versed in Hindu and Sikh philosophy and religion, he was chosen for an excavation project at the revered Kashi Vishwanath Temple, one of the 12 Jyotirlingas, the holiest Shiva temples. The task was to study and document newly unearthed relics that had recently been discovered beneath the temple grounds. James had heard rumors of an ancient sanctuary that once stood where the Kashi Vishwanath temple now dominated. Scholars had long debated its origins, speculating that it might have been dedicated to Vishnu and built during a time when the city was a flourishing center of Vaishnavite worship. This prospect excited him not only for its historical significance, but also for the professional acclaim that such a discovery would bring. James adjusted his satchel and stepped toward the temple, his eyes scanning the intricate carvings with a critical eye. Humorous, an ascetic sect known for extreme Hinduism, roamed the temple grounds. Ignoring the incense and chants, he focused on the worn stone steps, tracing the passage of countless feet over centuries. His fingers brushed against the ancient stone, lingering longer than necessary. His distrust, a fortress against the unknown, was built brick by brick from his strictly rational upbringing. His father, a staunch scientist, had always dismissed anything that couldn't be quantified or measured. Yet, the allure of the mystical and the unexplainable had always gnawed at the edges of James's curiosity. Weeks passed as James meticulously cataloged statues, pottery fragments, and other relics brought up by the excavation team. He spent his days under the relentless sun and his evenings in quiet reflection, poring over his notes and comparing them with historical texts. The heat, the dust, and the ceaseless hum of the city created a backdrop of sensory overload, grounding him in the present even as he delved into the past. The distant sounds of political rallies and protests occasionally broke the monotony, reminding him of the larger currents of change sweeping the nation. One afternoon, Pandit Sharma, the temple's priest and scholar, approached James with a bundle wrapped in cloth. Earlier, workers had found it deep within the temple sanctum. And now, silhouetted against the glaring sun, he carried it with a solemn grace. "What have you there, Pandit Sharma?" James asked, dusting his hands off as he stood. The Pandit paused. "This manuscript was among the items uncovered today, Sahib. The workers thought it prudent to bring it directly to me." James raised an eyebrow. "May I?" he asked, reaching out. Pandit Sharma hesitated for a moment before handing it over. "Of course, Mr. Montgomery." It was a weathered leather manuscript. The cover was adorned with unusual mandalas and arcane symbols. Intrigued, James carefully opened the manuscript. His eyes widened slightly. These symbols, they could date back to the time of the Gupta Empire or even earlier. "Is that possible?" "Very likely, Sahib," the Pandit replied, his voice measured. "That part of the temple has not been disturbed in centuries." James traced a finger over the inscriptions. "These inscriptions, they're unlike anything we've found so far. Quite remarkable how much light this could shed on our understanding of the past." Pandit Sharma nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, it sheds light on forgotten chapters. But even a small light can cast long shadows." James paused, considering the Pandit's words, then smiled slightly. "I am not merely here to unearth the past, Pandit Sharma. I aim to awaken it." Pandit Sharma met his gaze, a hint of understanding in his eyes. "Be mindful, Sahib. Awakened pasts can have lives of their own." James's smile grew. "Precisely, Pandit." He then glanced up, a touch of condescension in his voice. "You're done here. Thanks." With a slight nod, Pandit Sharma turned and walked away, leaving James alone with the manuscript. As James deciphered the text, his breath caught. The manuscript chronicled his life with chilling precision, like a mirror reflecting his deepest secrets. Determined to uncover the manuscript's origins, James carefully closed the ancient pages and clutched it to his chest. He approached one of the workers from the excavation team, asking about the manuscript's origins. They confirmed it had been unearthed from a chamber beneath the temple, near an older sanctuary possibly dedicated to Vishnu, the preserver of time and destiny. James couldn't believe his luck. This find suggested a time when Vaishnavism thrived in Varanasi, possibly before Shaivism took prominence. Archaeologists had searched for this temple for decades, and here it was, right under his feet. His professional hubris soared. He would be the one to unveil its mysteries. The excavation sparked heated debates among local authorities and religious figures. Many saw it as exploitative and desecrating sacred sites. Workers labored under brutal conditions, some collapsing from exhaustion, a few already dead. Precious relics were bound for Britain, trophies of conquest rather than cultural treasures. James saw how the British Raj thrived on deepening religious divides to maintain control. That night, he took the manuscript with him, its weight heavy in his bag. Stepping out of the temple, a sensation of being watched washed over him. He glanced around but saw only the sleepy sun and the twinkle of distant torches. As James moved towards the exit, a nearly naked figure covered in ashes stepped into his path. The Agari's unblinking eyes bored into his, like twin voids absorbing all light. Without a word, he briefly extended his hand, touching James's chest before drawing back. "The past is not a place you can escape," he murmured, his voice a low rasp. He then stepped aside, allowing James to continue. Other Agoras stood like statues in the shade, their eyes fixed on him. He could feel their silent stares following him as he made his way home. Under the weak light of a lone bulb, James hunched over the ancient manuscript spread across the makeshift desk in his rented room near the Ghats. Night had fallen over Varanasi, a cloak of silence occasionally pierced by the distant clamor of street vendors closing shop. His eyes traced the faded Sanskrit inscribed on parchment. The air around him felt unnaturally still, as if the darkness outside was staring at him. As he read further, the words exposed his deepest fears of inadequacy and the recent failure of his marriage. It described the sudden illness and death of his childhood friend, an event that had haunted him for years. It recounted the tragic accident that claimed his sister, down to the exact date and circumstances. The text also revealed his deepest aspirations: to return to Britain as a celebrated scholar, juxtaposed with a chilling prediction that he would never leave India. The manuscript spoke of a future where his work would remain unfinished, his dreams unfulfilled. It knew his private regrets, the letters he wrote but never sent, and his secret fears of dying alone in a foreign land. One evening, a passage caught his eye, a prophecy marking a specific date, ominously close. It predicted a fire that would engulf the Manikarnika Ghat, where the bodies of the dead are cremated in ceaseless pyres. It detailed an ominous ritual involving a sacrifice, draped in white ashes with stark red markings across their foreheads, appearing frequently in his windows and following him around town. They spoke no words but watched him with an intensity that left his skin crawling. One morning, he found a small clay statue of Shiva outside his door, its eyes painted a vivid red that seemed to follow him into his dream. The auguries seemed less like mere devotees and more like heralds of impending doom. They left offerings that were both a blessing and a warning: fragrant bundles of herbs used in ancient death rituals, cryptic notes penned in an almost forgotten script, hinting at the inevitable turn of the cosmic wheel. As the festival of Mahashivaratri, the great night of Shiva, approached, bringing crowds of pilgrims to the city, James decided it was time to leave India immediately. He hastily packed his belongings and made plans to buy a ticket for the next ship back to Britain. He rushed back to the temple to gather his materials and return the manuscript, hoping to distance himself from the dark predictions. He walked through crowds of devotees, lost in their reverent prayers. Behind him, the procession of silent agoras maintained their vigil. Beyond mere observers, they seemed to usher him toward a destiny he had yet to comprehend. Pushing open the chamber's heavy stone door, the manuscript in his bag felt like a living heart beating in sync with his own. A heart that felt, with dreadful certainty, the true nature of the cycle it was bound to. He sensed the followers just beyond the doorway, their silent presence pressing in on him. The musty smell of the ancient parchment mingled with the faint scent of incense. He gently put down the manuscript, but the intricate symbols and diagrams evoked an overwhelming familiarity. The memory of his mentor, Dr. Robert Astor, came unbidden. Astor's voice, rich with reverence, speaking of the Akashic records, that boundless archive of all that ever was and will be. Dr. Astor had described it as an energetic log of all existence, recorded in a non-physical plane known as the ether. James had always dismissed these notions as esoteric ramblings, but now, in the manuscript's presence, he felt a dawning realization that perhaps his mentor had been right all along. James had always viewed the teachings of the Upanishads as academic, yet the manuscript's unsettling synchronicities brought them to life, defying his scholarly detachment. He had searched for logical explanations, but each attempt only deepened his unease. The weight of inevitability grew, pressing down on him like an unseen force. It was as if the manuscript tapped into something profound and ancient, recording the fate of humanity with chilling precision. It felt as if the manuscript was a conduit to the Akashic records themselves, linking him to an endless archive of existence. Brahman, the ultimate reality, no longer seemed a distant metaphysical idea, but a palpable truth closing in on him. He felt an inexplicable compulsion to venture deeper into the sanctum. The air grew denser, charged with an energy that made the hairs on his neck stand. Intricate mandalas adorned the walls, their interlocking patterns subtly swirling, almost alive, drawing him further in. The sense of an unseen force grew more intense, a nearly tangible presence pressing in from all sides. Then, at the heart of the sanctum, James encountered the Timeless One. The entity had no definitive form, appearing as a floating mandala, a geometric figure of shifting forms and glowing light that seemed to be everywhere all at once. An irresistible pull gripped him, his feet moving of their own accord, drawing him into the heart of the mandala. Stepping into it, James found himself in the vast library of the Akashic Records, where every event, thought, and possibility was catalogued in endless corridors of knowledge. Shelves stretched beyond sight, each filled with tomes of every life that had ever been and ever would be. He walked through the library, his fingers brushing against ancient scrolls. Each revealed a different path he could have taken, yet all led back to the mandala's center. Every choice, every action had led him here. James encountered visions of his life as he drifted through the Akashic Records. Moments of joy and sorrow, triumph and failure. He saw himself as a child, staring wide-eyed at the night sky, dreaming of its mysteries. He saw his younger self, full of ambition and determination, seeking to unravel the secrets of the past. And he saw his present self, standing at the threshold of cosmic enlightenment, poised to transcend the limits of human understanding. The realization struck him with profound clarity. The illusion of Maya unraveled before his eyes. James's lingering self, a fragile residue of his identity, resisted the truth. He saw himself standing at the edge of the void, the vast expanse of the Akashic Records stretching before him. With a final, desperate act of surrender, he let go, allowing himself to fall into the mandala's center. The geometric patterns converged into a blinding point of light. And in that light, the true nature of the universe was revealed to James. The boundaries of his being faded away, replaced by the infinite expanse of the cosmic order. Enlightenment and terror walked hand in hand through his psyche, as he became one with the eternal truths that had tormented him. Stepping out of the shining temple, naked and transformed, Auguras waited outside, eyes filled with reverence. Their chants, a deep hum of Om Namah Shivaya, rose and fell like tide. They approached, hands gentle but firm, painting his body with ashes in a sacred and surreal ritual. The manuscript's revelations had stripped him of his former self, exposing him to the Timeless One. Shadows blinked under the torchlight, twisting into hideous forms. The Agari's chants swelled, their voices merging into an ominous crescendo. The night pulsed with otherworldly energy. The streets, the river, the city itself seemed to writhe with their own life. The Agaris approached, their hands moving with ritualistic precision, smearing his skin with ashes. The chants grew louder, each note a harbinger of the horrors hidden within that ancient manuscript. The smell of burnt offerings clinging to the air, mingling with the earthy scent of the river. With eyes dark and impenetrable, the Agaris lifted him onto a makeshift bier. Their chants rose as they carried him through the narrow streets, the fire casting long shadows on ancient walls. The city watched in silence as if holding its breath. The procession reached the ghats, where pyres crackled with an insatiable hunger. They laid him on the pyre, the wood rough against his skin. The flames licked at his skin like a searing pan. The Aghoras surrounded him, their chants reaching a fevered pitch. He raised his arms and covered his eyes. The words of Krishna to Arjuna rose from the depths of his memory, carried by a voice that felt both his own and not. If the radiance of 1,000 suns were to burst at once into the sky, that would be like the splendor of the Mighty One, he intoned, the words slicing through the night. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. The Agaris bowed, their chants rising to an otherworldly intensity, a tangible force pressing in from all sides. The inferno flared higher, casting grotesque silhouettes that danced and twisted in macabre patterns. As the pyre ignited, some Agoras stepped into the fire, their chants unwavering. One by one, their bodies were consumed in a final, fiery ritual. Others shared his roasted flesh in an act of utmost devotion. The night filled with the scent of burning flesh and sandalwood. The flames consumed him, the chants fading into a distant hum. The ghats of Varanasi glowed with an ethereal light, the river reflecting the divine dance. The night embraced him, the pyre's ashes mingling with the sacred waters, a tight-lipped witness to the eternal cycle. The end. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe our channel for more stories.
Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy our narrated stories.
I have always noticed a prevalent want of courage, even among persons of superior intelligence and culture, as to imparting their own psychological experiences when those have been of a strange sort. Almost all men are afraid that what they could relate in such wise would find no parallel or response in a listener's internal life, and might be suspected or laughed at. A truthful traveler, who should have seen some extraordinary creature in the likeness of a sea serpent, would have no fear of mentioning it, but the same traveler, having had some singular presentiment, impulse, vagary of thought, visions so-called, dream, or other remarkable mental impression, would hesitate considerably before he would own to it. To this reticence I attribute much of the obscurity in which such subjects are involved. We do not habitually communicate our experiences of these subjective things as we do our experiences of objective creation. The consequence is that the general stock of experience in this regard appears exceptional, and really is so, in respect of being miserably imperfect. In what I am going to relate, I have no intention of setting up, opposing, or supporting any theory whatever. I know the history of the bookseller of Berlin. I have studied the case of the wife of a late astronomer royal, as related by Sir David Brewster, and I have followed the minutest details of a much more remarkable case of spectral illusion occurring within my private circle of friends. It may be necessary to state, as to this last, that the sufferer, a lady, was in no degree, however distant, related to me. A mistaken assumption on that head might suggest an explanation of a part of my own case, but only a part, which would be wholly without foundation. I cannot be referred to my inheritance of any developed peculiarity, nor had I ever before any at all similar experience, nor have I ever had any at all similar experience since. It does not signify how many years ago, or how few, a certain murder was committed in England, which attracted great attention. We hear more than enough of murderers as they rise in succession to their atrocious eminence, and I would bury the memory of this particular brute, if I could, as his body was buried in Newgate Jail. I purposely abstain from giving any direct clue to the criminal's individuality. When the murder was first discovered, no suspicion fell, or I ought to say, for I cannot be too precise in my facts, it was nowhere publicly hinted that any suspicion fell on the man who was afterwards brought to trial. As no reference was at that time made to him in the newspapers, it is obviously impossible that any description of him can at that time have been given in the newspapers. It is essential that this fact be remembered. Unfolding at breakfast my morning paper containing the account of that first discovery, I found it to be deeply interesting, and I read it with close attention. I read it twice, if not 3 times. The discovery had been made in a bedroom, and when I laid down the paper, I was aware of a flash, rush, flow, I do not know what to call it, No word I can find is satisfactorily descriptive, in which I seem to see that bedroom passing through my room, like a picture impossibly painted on a running river. Though almost instantaneous in its passing, it was perfectly clear, so clear that I distinctly, and with a sense of relief, observed the absence of the dead body from the bed. It was in no romantic place that I had this curious sensation, but in chambers in Piccadilly, very near the corner of St. James Street. It was entirely new to me. I was in my easy chair at the moment, and the sensation was accompanied with a peculiar shiver which started the chair from its position. But it is to be noted that the chair ran easily on casters. I went to one of the windows. There are two in the room, and the room is on the second floor, to refresh my eyes with the moving objects down in Piccadilly. It was a bright autumn morning, and the street was sparkling and cheerful. The wind was high. As I looked out, it brought down from the park a quantity of fallen leaves, which a gust took and whirled into a spiral pillar. As the pillar fell and the leaves dispersed, I saw two men on the opposite side of the way, going from west to east. They were one behind the other. The foremost man often looked back over his shoulder. The second man followed him at a distance of some 30 paces, with his right hand menacingly raised. First, the singularity and steadiness of this threatening gesture in so public a thoroughfare attracted my attention, and next, the more remarkable circumstance that nobody heeded it. Both men threaded their way among the other passengers with a smoothness hardly consistent even with the action of walking on a pavement, and no single creature that I could see gave them place, touched them, or looked after them. In passing before my window, they both stared up at me. I saw their two faces very distinctly, and I knew that I could recognize them anywhere. Not that I had consciously noticed anything very remarkable in either face, except that the man who went first had an unusually lowering appearance, and that the face of the man who followed him was of the color of impure wax. I am a bachelor, and my valet and his wife constitute my whole establishment. My occupation is in a certain branch bank, and I wish that my duties as head of a department were as light as they are popularly supposed to be. They kept me in town that autumn when I stood in need of change. I was not ill, but I was not well. My reader is to make the most that can be reasonably made of my feeling jaded, having a depressing sense upon me of a monotonous life, and being slightly dyspeptic. I am assured by my renowned doctor that my real state of health at that time justifies no stronger description, and I quote his own from his written answer to my request for it. As the circumstances of the murder gradually unraveling took stronger and stronger possession of the public mind, I kept them away from mine by knowing as little about them as was possible in the midst of the universal excitement. But I knew that a verdict of willful murder had been found against the suspected murderer, and that he had been committed to Newgate for trial. I also knew that his trial had been postponed over 1 sessions of the Central Criminal Court on the ground of general prejudice and want of time for the preparation of the defense. I may further have known, but I believe I did not, when or about when the sessions to which his trial stood postponed would come on. My sitting room, bedroom, and dressing room are all on one floor. With the last, there is no communication but through the bedroom. True, there is a door in it, once communicating with the staircase, but a part of the fitting of my bath has been, and had been then for some years, fixed across it. At the same period, and as a part of the same arrangement, the door had been nailed up and canvassed over. I was standing in my bedroom late one night, giving some directions to my servant before he went to bed. My face was towards the only available door of communication with the dressing room, and it was closed. My servant's back was towards that door. While I was speaking to him, I saw it open and a man look in, who very earnestly and mysteriously beckoned to me. The man was the man who had gone second from the two along Piccadilly, and whose face was of the color of impure wax. The figure, having beckoned, drew back and closed the door. With no longer pause than was made by my crossing the bedroom, I opened the dressing-room door and looked in. I had a lighted candle already in my hand. I felt no inward expectation of seeing the figure in the dressing-room, and I did not see it there. Conscious that my servant stood amazed, I turned round to him and said, "Derek, could you believe that in my cool senses I fancied I saw a—" As I there laid my hand upon his breast, with a sudden start he trembled violently and said, "Oh Lord, yes, sir, a dead man beckoning." Now I do not believe that this John Derek, my trusty and attached servant for more than 20 years, had any impression whatever of having seen such a figure until I touched him. The change in him was so startling when I touched him that I fully believe he derived his impression in some occult manner from me at that instant. I bade John Derek bring me some brandy, and I gave him a dram and was glad to take one myself. Of what had preceded the night's phenomenon I told him not a single word. Reflecting on it, I was absolutely certain that I had never seen that face before, except on the one occasion in Piccadilly. Comparing its expression when beckoning at the door with its expression when it had stared up at me as I stood at my window, I came to the conclusion that on the first occasion it had sought to fasten itself upon my memory, and on the second occasion it had made sure of being immediately remembered. I was not very comfortable that night, though I felt a certainty, difficult to explain, that the figure would not return. At daylight I fell into a heavy sleep, from which I was awakened by John Derek's coming to my bedside with a paper in his hand. This paper, it appeared, had been the subject of an altercation at the door between its bearer and my servant. It was a summons to me to serve upon a jury at the forthcoming sessions of the Central Criminal Court at the Old Bailey. I had never before been summoned on such a jury, as John Derek well knew. He believed, I am not certain at this hour whether with reason or otherwise, that that class of jurors were customarily chosen on a lower qualification than mine, and he had at first refused to accept the summons. The man who served it had taken the matter very coolly. He said that my attendance or non-attendance was nothing to him. There the summons was, and I should deal with it at my own peril and not at his. For a day or two I was undecided whether to respond to this call or take no notice of it. I was not conscious of the slightest mysterious bias, influence, or attention one way or another. Of that I am as strictly sure as of every other statement that I make here. Ultimately I decided, as a break in the monotony of my life, that I would go. The appointed morning was a raw morning in the month of November. There was a dense brown fog in Piccadilly, and it became positively black, and in the last degree oppressive, east of Temple Bar. I found the passages and staircases of the courthouse flaringly lighted with gas, and the court itself similarly illuminated. I think that until I was conducted by officers into the old court and saw its crowded state, I did not know that the murderer was to be tried that day. I think that until I was so helped into the old court with considerable difficulty, I did not know into which of the two courts sitting my summons would take me. But this must not be received as a positive assertion, for I am not completely satisfied in my mind on either point. I took my seat in the place appropriated to jurors in waiting, and I looked about the court as well as I could through the cloud of fog and breath that was heavy in it. I noticed the black vapor hanging like a murky curtain outside the great windows, and I noticed the stifled sound of wheels on straw or tan that was littered in the street. Also, the hum of the people gathered there, which a shrill whistle or a louder song or hail than the rest occasionally pierced. Soon afterwards, the judges, 2 in number, entered and took their seats. The buzz in the court was awfully hushed. The direction was given to put the murderer to the bar. He appeared there, and in that same instant I recognized in him the first of the 2 men who had gone down Piccadilly. If my name had been called then, I doubt if I could have answered to it audibly. But it was called about 6th or 8th in the panel, and I was by that time able to say, "Here." Now observe, as I stepped into the box, the prisoner who had been looking on attentively, but with no sign of concern, became violently agitated and beckoned to his attorney. The prisoner's wish to challenge me was so manifest that it occasioned a pause, during which the attorney, with his hand upon the dock, whispered with his client and shook his head. I afterwards had it from that gentleman that the prisoner's first affrighted words to him were, "At all hazards, challenge that man!" But that as he could give no reason for it, and admitted that he had not even known my name until he heard it called and I appeared, it was not done. Both on the ground already explained, that I wished to avoid reviving an unwholesome memory of that murderer, and also because a detailed account of his long trial is by no means indispensable to my narrative, I shall confine myself closely to such incidents in the 10 days and nights during which we, the jury, were kept together, as directly bear on my own curious personal experience. It is to that, and not to a page of the Newgate calendar, that I beg attention. I was chosen foreman of the jury. On the second morning of the trial, after evidence had been taken for 2 hours, I heard the church clock strike. Happening to cast my eyes over my brother jurymen, I found an inexplicable difficulty in counting them. I counted them several times, yet always with the same difficulty. In short, I made them 1 too many. I touched the brother juryman whose place was next me, and I whispered to him, "Oblige me by counting us." He looked surprised by the request, but turned his head and counted. "Why," says he suddenly, "we are but no, that is not possible. No, we are 12. According to my counting that day, we were always right in detail, but in the gross we were always 1 too many. There was no appearance, no figure to account for it. But I had an inward foreshadowing of the figure that was surely coming. The jury were housed at the London Tavern. We all slept in 1 large room on separate tables, and we were constantly in the charge and under the eye of the officer sworn to hold us in safe keeping. I see no reason for suppressing the real name of that officer. He was intelligent, highly polite and obliging, and, I was glad to hear, much respected in the city. He had an agreeable presence, good eyes, enviable black whiskers, and a fine sonorous voice. His name was Mr. Harker. When we turned into our 12 beds at night, Mr. Harker's bed was drawn across the door. On the night of the second day, not being disposed to lie down, and seeing Mr. Harker sitting on his bed, I went and sat beside him and offered him a pinch of snuff. As Mr. Harker's hand touched mine in taking it from my box, a peculiar shiver crossed him, and he said, "Who is this?" Following Mr. Harker's eyes and looking along the room, I saw again the figure I expected, the second of the 2 men who had gone down Piccadilly. I rose and advanced a few steps, then stopped and looked round at Mr. Harker. He was quite unconcerned, laughed, and said in a pleasant way, "I thought for a moment we had a 13th juryman without a bed. But I see it is the moonlight." Making no revelation to Mr. Harker, but inviting him to take a walk with me to the end of the room, I watched what the figure did. It stood for a few moments by the bedside of each of my 11 brother jurymen, close to the pillow. It always went to the right-hand side of the bed and always passed out crossing the foot of the next bed. It seemed, from the action of the head, merely to look down pensively at each recumbent figure. It took no notice of me or of my bed, which was the nearest to Mr. Harker's. It seemed to go out where the moonlight came in, through a high window, as by an aerial flight of stairs. Next morning, at breakfast, it appeared that everybody present had dreamed of the murdered man last night, except myself and Mr. Harker. I now felt as convinced that the second man who had gone down Piccadilly was the murdered man, so to speak, as if it had been borne into my comprehension by his immediate testimony. But even this took place, and in a manner for which I was not at all prepared. On the 5th day of the trial, when the case for the prosecution was drawing to a close, a miniature of the murdered man, missing from his bedroom upon the discovery of the deed, and afterwards found in a hiding place where the murderer had been seen digging, was put in evidence. Having been identified by the witness under examination, it was handed up to the bench, and thence handed down to be inspected by the jury. As an officer in a black gown was making his way with it across to me, the figure of the second man, who had gone down Piccadilly, impetuously stared from the crowd, caught the miniature from the officer, and gave it to me in his own hands, at the same time saying in a low and hollow tone, before I saw the miniature, which was in a locket, "I was younger then, and my face was not then drained of blood." It also came between me and the brother juryman, to whom I would have given the miniature, and between him and the brother juryman, to whom he would have given it. And so it passed on through the whole of our number, and back into my possession. Not one of them, however, detected this. At table, and generally when we were shut up together in Mr. Harker's custody, we had from the first naturally discussed the day's proceedings a good deal. On that 5th day, the case for the prosecution being closed, and we having that side of the question in a completed shape before us, our discussion was more animated and serious. Among our number was a vestryman, the duncest idiot I've ever seen at large, who met the plainest evidence with the most preposterous objections, and who was sided with by 2 flabby parochial parasites, all 3 impaneled from a district so delivered over to fever that they ought to have been upon their own trial for 500 murders. When these mischievous blockheads were at their loudest, which was towards midnight, while some of us were already preparing for bed, I again saw the murdered man. He stood grimly behind them, beckoning to me. On my going towards them and striking into the conversation, he immediately retired. This was the beginning of a separate series of appearances, confined to that long room in which we were confined. Whenever a knot of my brother jurymen laid their heads together, I saw the head of the murdered man among theirs. Whenever their comparison of notes was going against him, he would solemnly and irresistibly beckon to me. It will be borne in mind that down to the production of the miniature on the 5th day of the trial, I had never seen the appearance in court. 3 changes occurred now as we entered on the case for the defense. 2 of them I will mention together first. The figure was now in court continually, and it never there addressed itself to me but always to the person who was speaking at the time. For instance, the throat of the murdered man had been cut straight across. In the opening speech for the defense, it was suggested that the deceased might have cut his own throat. At that very moment, the figure, with its throat in the dreadful condition referred to, this it had concealed before, stood at the speaker's elbow, motioning across its windpipe, now with the right hand, now with the left, vigorously suggesting to the speaker himself the impossibility of such a wound having been self-inflicted by either hand. For another instance, a witnessed character, a woman, deposed to the prisoner's being the most amiable of mankind. The figure at that instant stood on the floor before her, looking her full in the face and pointing out the prisoner's evil countenance with an extended arm and an outstretched finger. The third change now to be added impressed me strongly as the most marked and striking of all. I do not theorize upon it. I accurately state it and there leave it. Although the appearance was not itself perceived by those whom it addressed, its coming close to such persons was invariably attended by some trepidation or disturbance on their part. It seemed to me as if it were prevented by laws to which I was not amenable from fully revealing itself to others, and yet as if it could invisibly, dumbly, and darkly overshadow their minds. When the leading counsel for the defense suggested that hypothesis of suicide, and the figure stood at the learned gentleman's elbow frightfully sawing at its severed throat, it is undeniable that the counsel faltered in his speech, lost for a few seconds the thread of his ingenious discourse, wiped his forehead with his handkerchief, and turned extremely pale. When the witness to the character was confronted by the appearance, her eyes most certainly did follow the direction of its pointed finger, and rest with great hesitation and trouble upon the prisoner's face. 2 additional illustrations will suffice. On the 8th day of the trial, after the pause which was every day made early in the afternoon for a few minutes' rest and refreshment, I came back into court with the rest of the jury some little time before the return of the judges. Standing up in the box and looking about me, I thought the figure was not there until, chancing to raise my eyes to the gallery, I saw it bending forward and leaning over a very decent woman, as if to assure itself whether the judges had resumed their seats or not. Immediately afterwards, the woman screamed, fainted, and was carried out. So with the venerable, sagacious, and patient judge who conducted the trial. When the case was over, and he settled himself and his papers sum up, the murdered man, entering by the judge's door, advanced to his lordship's desk and looked eagerly over his shoulder at the pages of his notes which he was turning. A change came over his lordship's face. His hand stopped. The peculiar shiver that I knew so well passed over him. He faltered, "Excuse me, gentlemen, for a few minutes. I am somewhat oppressed by the vitiated air," and did not recover until he had drunk a glass of water. Through all the monotony of 6 of those interminable 10 days, the same judges and others on the bench, the same murderer in the dock, the same lawyers at the table, the same tones of questions and answers rising to the roof of the court, the same scratching of the judge's pen, the same ushers going in and out, the same lights kindled at the same hour when there had been any natural light of day, the same foggy curtain outside the great windows when it was foggy, the same rain pattering and dripping when it was rainy, the same footmarks of turnkeys and prisoners day after day on the same sawdust, the same keys locking and unlocking the same heavy doors. Through all the wearisome monotony, which made me feel as if I had been foreman of the jury for a vast period of time, and Piccadilly had flourished coevally with Babylon, the murdered man never lost one trace of his distinctness in my eyes, nor was he at any moment less distinct than anybody else. I must not omit, as a matter of fact, that I never once saw the appearance, which I call by the name of the murdered man, look at the murderer. Again and again I wondered, why does he not? But he never did. Nor did he look at me after the production of the miniature until the last closing minutes of the trial arrived. We retired to consider at 7 minutes before 10 at night. The idiomatic vestryman and his 2 parochial parasites gave us so much trouble that we twice returned into court to beg to have certain extracts from the judge's notes reread. 9 of us had not the smallest doubt about those passages. Neither, I believe, had anyone in the court. The dunder-headed triumvirate, having no idea but obstruction, disputed them for that very reason. At length we prevailed, and finally the jury returned into court at 10 minutes past 12. The murdered man at that time stood directly opposite the jury box, on the other side of the court. As I took my place, his eyes rested on me with great attention. He seemed satisfied, and slowly shook a great gray veil, which he carried on his arm for the first time, over his head and whole form. As I gave in our verdict, guilty, the veil collapsed, all was gone, and his empty. The murderer, being asked by the judge according to usage whether he had anything to say before sentence of death should be passed upon him, indistinctly muttered something which was described in the leading newspapers the following day as a few rambling and half-audible words, in which he was understood to complain that he had not had a fair trial because the foreman of the jury possessed against. The remarkable declaration that he really made was this: "My lord, I knew I was a doomed man when the foreman of my jury came into the box. My lord, I knew he would never let me off, because before I was taken, he somehow got to my bedside in the night, woke me, and put a rope round my neck."
Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy our narrated stories. My clay hands are becoming solid porcelain. I have always had potter's hands. The throwing water absorbs the moisturizing oils of the skin, leaves the hands rough. The clay paste dries and cracks the skin, leaving it red. But now my hands are hardening. In the bisque firing, my hands harden like porous greenware. The cremated carbon and sulfur escape, exhuming my soul from the earth and clay, little by little drawing it back to its source. The soul stews out in a boiling whistle, agitating out from between the minerals lodged in the ridges and wrinkles of each digit. The palms petrify. The flesh sinters, binds to itself. In the glaze firing, my hands glow, stiffens, and makes the fingers rigid and reflective. The silicate vitrifies and turns to glass. Dust becomes crystal, like a baby's flesh crystallizing into the windows of the eyes. I am born again in the womb of the kiln. I am a porcelain and ordered for a series of 6 ornate hand-painted vases. It is enough money for Dandan's first semester. But I don't know if though I struggle to find my hands, which have become ghost appendages. I tell no one. I am frightened the orders will. Dan has been accepted at Columbia University. She's wanted to go to the United States, and she will need money. So I struggle to find strength and answers for her. But I fear the pull of Tai Shen, the great spirit. the creator god pulling back the breath of life infused in this jar of clay. The January mornings are misty, with a cold in the valley. My hands ache from the cold and wet the river. Though my touch is going, I still feel hot and cold. The dirt is hard and smells like the burned dust of the kiln. I dig clay from the banks of the GL. Back at my home shop in Sikiku, I mix various minerals into the clay: kaolin, silica, and feldspars. I then wedge the day's clay on a long wooden table, folding and pressing to remove all of the air. If I do not get out all of the air, the clay will crack in the kiln. Then I begin the process of forming the clay into the shape of finished goods and ready it for 5 days of firing. For pottery, we use a wheel. For complex shapes, a mold. As I mold today's clay into traditional teacups using delicate molds, Dandan brings me my morning tea. It is a jasmine tea. It is a honey orchid oolong. It smells of irises and orchids and the misty meadows of the Shikingong Mountain, sweet like nutty molasses with notes of a mild bitter metallic roast. Bright, coppery, and clean, with an aftertaste of the esters of bubblegum powder that is distinctive of the jasmine resin. I am a simple rice bowl. Dan is a hand-painted dining set. My given name is Jing Yuchi, but Dandan and everyone else call me Jane. Sikiku, or Longyan Town in Chongqing, China, is an ancient place. It means porcelain village and, if legend is to be believed, is the birthplace of the stone streets border ancestral tea houses, pagodas, street food vendors selling doughy mahua, and antique shops with strings of hanging red lanterns on every storefront. The Baolun Temple stands above the town and stares back at the North Gate. Nin is excited for the Lantern Festival next week. It will be her last before her travels and her great adventure. We need to get ready for the Lantern Festival. Dan says, Bao B, I have a big order I have to fill first. I tell her, poof, forget about your orders, I am making the Tang Yuan. I went to everything: brown sugar, sesame seed, walnut, and bean paste, and lots of rice. She says, you go in and start without meaning you. I have to go down to the market and see Dr. Louisu out the pain in my hands. I say, it is so beautiful in the market this time of year. I will miss all of the red lanterns. You know what the old legend says the reason is for the red lanterns. Dandan says, wanting to tell me for the 1100th time, no bail bi. What is it? I humor her. The Jade Emperor sensed an uprising when his favorite crane was killed by his villagers. He resolved to destroy the old village on the 15th day of the new moon. The Yuan Xiao Jie. But his daughter overheard his plan. The princess was in love with a poor fisherman's boy in the village. Knowing what was going to happen, she warned the villagers to put up red lanterns all over town. Then she fooled her father, telling him that the gods had already burned the village. And so every year, we use the red lantern to see of a young girl that overthrows the ill-fated curse of a tyrannical lord and to pray for Yuan Yu, a fortunate new beginning. Dandan says, her face bright with a satisfied smile, you will have your own bright new beginning soon enough. Now go finish making the pain in your come help me with the rice balls. Dandan pleaded. Later, Bao B. Later. I say, Dr. Zhu is a stout man whose black hair has a thick luster, like that of a horse, embroidered with a few shiny thistles of white. His eyes are bright and skin-taut, featuring a vibrancy that is unusual for a man of 76. He wears a white hanfu linen shirt with frog buttons and a choker collar. He smells of licorice and lemon and carries himself in a calm, exacting manner. Nushi Yuchi, what is bothering you? He asks. I am losing feeling in my hands. Losing touch, I tell him. Oh, Jane, that must be terrifying for you, he says, taking my right hand and needling it in a form of massage, pulling on the fingers and working his way down each of the bones of the hand and pressing and squeezing my thumb. Your energy is very weak in these hands. When I am working with the clay, I can't feel where my hand ends and the clay begins, and sometimes I look down and my hands are off the wheel. I tell him, your yin or po can be separated from your spirit. You body. Zao, and the calling back of the soul. But I have no delirium. There are no devils hiding in my closets. I say, maybe no devils, but Dandan is your heart. She is going to New York soon. Your essence is cold as marrow is cold. Your yang is unstable. But like, you must steal a heart to replace lost heart, or you will lose all feeling and body and spirit will be parted forever. Dr. Zhu says, Zhao Hundun or Po Tianhuang, cure for cold body, bore open chaos and destroy heaven's neglect. He adds with a wry grin that only a very old man can pull off. You want me to take a lover at 67? I say perplexed. And then joke, Dr. Zhu. Are you flirting with me? Take a lover. Adopt a stray dog. Whatever it takes to bring feeling back in balance. One more thing, Nushi Yuchi, get yourself some warm clothes. There will be snow for the Yuan Xiao Jie. All week, there have been clouds over the moon. How does an old lady steal a heart? Is one thing for Dandan, but for an old lady like me who is losing her sense of touch to touch another human heart, let alone steal it, is a tall order. I puzzle over strategies and tactics. Food comes to mind. Visual allure is not entirely out of the question, as I have kept my figure and practice yoga daily. Dandan is the storyteller. I have no aptitude for words. Painting is another idea. But whose heart can I steal? Where do I even look? Will there be someone at the winter festival of the new moon? The mail lady delivers my mail and the check for the 6 faces is there just in time. I will have to go later and deposit this and get a traveler's check for the gift. I place the bisqueware on a cookie and begin the process of applying the initial glaze coloring. These large white gourd vases are painted with 3 layers of blue glaze. On the mouth are the petals of opening flowers, leading to a border by the lip of the vase. Below, at the bottom of the neck, is another border and a skirt to separate the body of the vase, with branching vines and ornate circular flowers in a fractal design, painted around on the curves of the vase to create an effect-like movement. I add 2 bluebirds and a hummingbird for added. Now for the glaze in 3, the final touches. And I can't forget the final touch of my special gift, the porcelain chest. I go to see my friend Cece, who works at the candy shop across the way. I walk in past the tourists, and we go in the back area of the shop where she is watching The Real Housewives of New Jersey and spending time on WeChat with her American boyfriend. Cece has big mantis-like eyes and a rounded head. Her hair seems flat on top like a small, tight-fitting cap. Her cheeks are warm and curious, but she has a serious chin. Jane, you came such a long way to see me. I am so delighted. Will you be coming out for the Lantern Festival Friday? I wouldn't miss it. I tell her. So what is going on, Janie? She asks. Dr. Zhu says I have to steal a heart. I say, at your age, you'd sooner steal a penny off a dead man's eyes. She says, hey, I say, it isn't that bad, is it? And I blush, and we both break out in laughter. You know the old folk story about the farmer, right? About the luck. Sissy says, "No, tell it to me." I say, "A farmer gets a horse, which soon runs away. A neighbor says, that's bad news." The farmer replies, "Good news, bad news, who can say?" The horse comes back, brings a horse with him. Good news, you might say. The farmer gives the second horse to his son, who rides it, then is thrown and badly breaks his leg. "So sorry for your bad news," says the concerned neighbor. "Good news, bad news, who can say?" "Tss," the farmer replies. In a week or so, the emperor's men come and take every able-bodied young man to fight in a war. The farmer's son is spared. Okay, that is a good story, but I don't know what I'm supposed to get from that. I tell her, "It could mean a lot of things, but what I think is maybe you are having trouble letting go of Dan. Maybe, like the horse that runs away comes back with another horse, you gain more by letting her go. Maybe you not meant to steal man's heart. Maybe steal back Dan's heart, make sure she come back to you. Cece, you are very smart and wise. Thank you so much." I tell her and head back to check on my gourd vases and my special porcelain chest. Sikiku is fully lit with thousands of red lanterns, and the Baolun temple is a shining spire, like a tower of red flames, lit and inscribed with hundreds of sigils, all in ornate calligraphy, hanging down in ribbons from its many eaves and archways and boat-like slanting porticos. Throngs of people crowd the streets. The moon is full in the sky. The brisk wind blows, pulling at their scarves and caps and whistling through the ornamental ribbons covered with calligraphy. The riddles attached to the sky lanterns, waves of fluffy white snow tumble down in zigzagging waves, making the stone walkway squeak as peals of laughter and chatter echo down the promenade. Everyone is walking down to the river by the Baolun temple, where the launching of the sky lanterns will take place. "Amma, if you can answer my riddle, you will shoot the literary tiger and all the pain in your hands will go away," Dan tells me. Dan's sky lantern has a cryptic riddle hanging off of it in ornate Chinese calligraphy. "I can follow you for thousands of miles and not miss home. I do not fear cold or fire, and I desire neither food nor drink. But I disappear when the sun sets behind the western mountains. Who am I? I think on this a long time. I think I know the answer, but I save this secret and hold it in escrow for later. Happy you. Bio B. How did your Tang Yuan come out?" I ask. "Here, try." Dan says, sticking the sugary dough in my mouth. I chew and taste the brown sugar and the crunchy walnut and gluey bean curd. Very good, Niu, your best yet." Tuan, yuan, happy reunion, happy family. We will miss this next year. I tell her, "Oh, Amma, I will be back to see you." I'm not leaving forever. She says, "Say the Kai Den Ki Fu, prayer for good fortune, that you will be back next year and in good health." I tell her, and she does. We reach the river. The fireworks begin to go off, signaling the beginning of the Fang Tian Deng, the time for the releasing of the sky lanterns, with prayers and wishes for the heavens. The snow is coming down now in thick blankets, the drifting flakes shimmering with the light of the moon, and the thousands of lanterns everyone is holding along the banks. I think I know the answer to your riddle, Bao B.I. Goes for thousands of miles, doesn't get hot or cold, doesn't fear, but disappears with the dying sun. It is a shadow. I tell her, "Very good, Amma. You will have much good fortune this new year." Dan says, "And now it is time for your New Year's gift," I say with a smile. "Amma, what gift?" "You didn't have to get me anything." Dan says, "Oh, Bao B.I. I am so proud of you and excited for your journey, but I will miss you very much. Here, this is for you." I pull out a porcelain chest crafted in red clay in the shape of a heart, glazed 3 times, with a red bright glaze like that of the lanterns. Dandan looks up and smiles, and holds the porcelain vest close to her chest. "Oh, Amma, this is so sweet." "Open it new," I tell her. My hands shake in the cold, but I can scarcely place my fingers. All of the feeling is tingly and tentative, like a spirit without a body, wisping along, transparent as air. She opens the hinge of the lid of the chest and looks inside and sees a key with a red ribbon attached to a little gold locket. "What is it, Amma?" Dandan asks. "It is a key to the store, so you can come back anytime, even if I am not there. It will always be yours." "And a locket to make new memories. Maybe you will meet a friend or a love at school. And be sure to bring them back home to me when you return." "Thank you, Amma. I will, of course. You will always be my heart." Dandan says, I feel a tingle in my fingers, where the clay is softening in the warmth of the moment. I can feel the heat of the lantern radiate through my palms and up my forearm. We take the lanterns and hoist them into the air. 1,000 prayers lift into the sky and glow. The red lights blow in the breeze like the spirits of the mountain, snaking along with the gush of the river and the rush of the cold January breeze. I hold Dandan in my arms a long time before we go home. I take the porcelain village out of the kiln. It cools and dries along the banks of the Jialing River. It freezes in time, like a memory. It is smooth to the touch, glassy and full of hidden meanings like fine china. The end. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe our channel for more stories.
Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy our narrated stories. The trouble with Harrowby Hall was that it was haunted. What was worse, the ghost did not content itself with merely appearing at the bedside of the afflicted person who saw it, but persisted in remaining there for 1 mortal hour before it would disappear. It never appeared except on Christmas Eve, and then as the clock was striking 12, in which respect alone was it lacking in that originality which in these days is a sine qua non of success in spectral life. The owners of Harrowby Hall had done their utmost to rid themselves of the damp and dewy lady who rose up out of the best bedroom floor at midnight, but without avail. They had tried stopping the clock so that the ghost would not know when it was midnight, but she made her appearance just the same, with that fearful, miasmatic personality of hers. And there she would stand until everything about her was thoroughly saturated. Then the owners of Harrowby Hall caulked up every crack in the floor with the very best quality of hemp, and over this were placed layers of tar and canvas. The walls were made waterproof, and the doors and windows likewise, the proprietors having conceived the notion that the unexercised lady would find it difficult to leak into the room after these precautions had been taken. But even this did not suffice. The following Christmas Eve she appeared as promptly as before, and frightened the occupant of the room quite out of his senses by sitting down alongside of him and gazing with her cavernous blue eyes into his. And he noticed, too, that in her long, aqueously bony fingers, bits of dripping seaweed were entwined, the ends hanging down, and these ends she drew across his forehead until he became like one insane. And then he swooned away and was found unconscious in his bed the next morning by his host, simply saturated with seawater and fright, from the combined effects of which he never recovered, dying 4 years later of pneumonia, and nervous prostration at the age of 78. The next year, the master of Harrowby Hall decided not to have the best spare bedroom opened at all, thinking that perhaps the ghost's thirst for making herself disagreeable would be satisfied by haunting the furniture. But the plan was as unavailing as the many that had preceded it. The ghost appeared as usual in the room. That is, it was supposed she did, for the hangings were dripping wet the next morning, and in the parlor below the haunted room a great damp spot appeared on the ceiling. Finding no one there, she immediately set out to learn the reason why, and she chose none other to haunt than the owner of the Harrowby himself. She found him in his own cozy room, drinking whiskey undiluted, and felicitating himself upon having foiled her ghostship, when all of a sudden the curl went out of his hair, his whiskey bottle filled and overflowed, and he was himself in a condition similar to that of a man who has fallen into a water butt. When he recovered from the shock, which was a painful one, he saw before him the lady of the cavernous eyes and seaweed fingers. The sight was so unexpected and so terrifying that he fainted, but immediately came to, because of the vast amount of water in his hair, which, trickling down over his face, restored his consciousness. Now it so happened that the master of Harrowby was a brave man, and while he was not particularly fond of interviewing ghosts, especially such quenching ghosts as the one before him, he was not to be daunted by an apparition. He had paid the lady the compliment of fainting from the effects of his first surprise, and now that he had come to, he intended to find out a few things he felt he had a right to know. He would have liked to put on a dry suit of clothes first, but the apparition declined to leave him for an instant until her hour was up, and he was forced to deny himself that pleasure. Every time he would move, she would follow him, with the result that everything she came in contact with got a ducking. In an effort to warm himself up, he approached the fire. An unfortunate move, as it turned out, because it brought the ghost directly over the fire, which was immediately extinguished. The whiskey became utterly valueless as a comforter to his chilled system, because it was by this time diluted to a proportion of 90% of water. The only thing he could do to ward off the evil effects of his encounter he did, and that was to swallow 10 2-grain quinine pills, which he managed to put into his mouth before the ghost had time to interfere. Having done this, he turned with some asperity to the ghost and said, "Far be it from me to be impolite to a woman, madam, but I'm hanged if it wouldn't please me better if you'd stop these infernal visits of yours to this house. Go sit out on the lake if you like that sort of thing. Soak the water butt if you wish, but do not, I implore you, come into a gentleman's house and saturate him and his possessions in this way. It is damned disagreeable." "Henry Hartwick Oglethorpe," said the ghost in a gurgling voice, "you don't know what you're talking about." "Madam," returned the unhappy householder, "I wish that remark was strictly truthful. I was talking about you. It would be shillings and pence, nay, pounds in my pocket, madam, if I did not know of you." "That is a bit of specious nonsense," returned the ghost, throwing a quart of indignation into the face of the master of Harrowby. "It may rank as high as repartee, but as a comment upon my statement that you do not know what you are talking about, it savors of irrelevant impertinence. You do not know that I am compelled to haunt this place year after year by inexorable fate. It is no pleasure to me to enter this house and ruin and mildew everything I touch. I never aspired to be a shower bath, but it is my doom. Do you know who I am?" "No, I don't," returned the master of Harrowby. "I should say you were the Lady of the Lake, or Little Sally Waters." "You are a witty man for your years," said the ghost. "Well, my humor is drier than yours will ever be," returned the master. "No doubt. I am never dry. I am the water ghost of Harrowby Hall, and dryness is a quality entirely beyond my wildest hope. I have been the incumbent of this highly unpleasant office for 200 years tonight." "How the deuce did you ever come to get elected?" asked the master. "Through a suicide," replied the spectre. "I am the ghost of that fair maiden whose picture hangs over the mantelpiece in the drawing-room. I should have been your great-great-great-great-great-aunt if I had lived, Henry Hartwig Oglethorpe, for I was the own sister of your great-great-great-great-grandfather." "But what induced you to get this house into such a predicament?" "I was not to blame, sir," returned the lady. "It was my father's fault. He it was who built Harrowby Hall, and the haunted chamber was to have been mine. My father had it furnished in pink and yellow, knowing well that blue and gray formed the only combination of color I could tolerate. He did it merely to spite me, and with what I deem a proper spirit, I declined to live in the room, whereupon my father said I could live there or on the lawn, he didn't care which. That night I ran from the house and jumped over the cliff into the sea." "That was rash," said the master of Harrowby. "So I've heard," returned the ghost. "If I had known what the consequences were to be, I should not have jumped. But I never really realized what I was doing until after I was drowned. I had been drowned a week when a sea nymph came to me and informed me that I was to be one of her followers forever afterwards, adding that it should be my doom to haunt Harrowby Hall for 1 hour every Christmas Eve throughout the rest of eternity. I was to haunt that room on such Christmas Eves as I found it inhabited, and if it should turn out not to be inhabited, I was and am to spend the allotted hour with the head of the house." "I'll sell the place." "That you cannot do, for it is also required of me that I shall appear as the deeds are to be delivered to any purchaser, and divulge to him the awful secret of the house." "Do you mean to tell me that on every Christmas Eve that I don't happen to have somebody in that guest chamber, you are going to haunt me wherever I may be, ruining my whiskey, taking all the curl out of my hair, extinguishing my fire, and soaking me through to the skin?" demanded the master. "You have stated the case, Oglethorpe, and what is more," said the water ghost, "it doesn't make the slightest difference where you are. If I find that room empty, wherever you may be, I shall douse you with my spectral Here the clock struck 1, and immediately the apparition faded away. It was perhaps more of a trickle than a fade, but as a disappearance it was complete. "By St. George and his dragon," ejaculated the master of Harrowby, wringing his hands, "it is guineas to hot cross buns that next Christmas there's an occupant of the spare room, or I spend the night in a bathtub." But the master of Harrowby would have lost his wager had there been anyone there to take him up. For when Christmas Eve came again, he was in his grave, never having recovered from the cold contracted that awful night. Harrowby Hall was closed, and the heir to the estate was in London, where to him in his chambers came the same experience that his father had gone through, saving only that, being younger and stronger, he survived the shock. Everything in his rooms was ruined. His clocks were rusted in the works, a fine collection of watercolor drawings was entirely obliterated by the onslaught of the water ghost, and what was worse, the apartments below his were drenched with the water soaking through the floors, a damage for which he was compelled to pay, and which resulted in his being requested by his landlady to vacate the premises immediately. The story of the visitation inflicted upon his family had gone abroad, and no one could be got to invite him out to any function save afternoon teas and receptions. Fathers of daughters declined to permit him to remain in their houses later than 8 o'clock at night, not knowing but that some emergency might arise in the supernatural world, which would require the unexpected appearance of the water ghost in this on nights other than Christmas Eve, and before the mystic hour when weary churchyards, ignoring the rules which are supposed to govern polite society, began to yawn. Nor would the maids themselves have aught to do with him, fearing the destruction by the sudden incursion of aqueous femininity of the costumes which they held most dear. So the heir of Harrowby Hall resolved, as his ancestors for several generations before him had resolved, that something must be done. His first thought was to make one of his servants occupy the haunted rooms at the crucial moment, but in this he tailed, because the servants themselves knew the history of that room and rebelled. None of his friends would consent to sacrifice their personal comfort to his, nor was there to be found in all of England a man so poor as to be willing to occupy the doomed chamber on Christmas Eve for pay. Then the thought came to the heir to have the fireplace in the room enlarged, so that he might evaporate the ghost at its first appearance, and he was felicitating himself upon the ingenuity of his plan when he remembered what his father had told him, how that no fire could withstand the lady's extremely contagious dampness. And then he bethought him of steam pipes. These, he remembered, could lie hundreds of feet deep in water and still retain sufficient heat to drive the water away in a vapor, and as a result of this, thought the haunted room was heated by steam to a withering degree, and the heir for 6 months attended daily the Turkish baths, so that when Christmas Eve came he could himself withstand the awful temperature of the room. The scheme was only partially successful. The water ghost appeared at the specified time and found the heir of Harrowby prepared. But hot as the room was, it shortened her visit by no more than 5 minutes in the hour, during which time the nervous system of the young master was well nigh shattered, and the room itself was cracked and warped to an extent which required the outlay of a large sum of money to remedy. And worse than this, as the last drop of the water ghost was slowly sizzling itself out on the floor, she whispered to her would-be conqueror that his scheme would avail him nothing, because there was still water in great plenty where she came from, and that next year would find her rehabilitated and as exasperatingly saturating as ever. It was then that the natural action of the mind, in going from one extreme to the other, suggested to the ingenious heir of Harrowby the means by which the water ghost was ultimately conquered, and happiness once more came within the grasp of the house of Oglethorpe. The heir provided himself with a warm suit of fur underclothing. Donning this with the furry side in, he placed over it a rubber garment, tight-fitting, which he wore just as a woman wears a jersey. On top of this he placed another set of underclothing, this suit made of wool, and over this was a second rubber garment like the first. Upon his head he placed a light and comfortable diving helmet, and so clad on the following Christmas Eve he awaited the coming of his tormentor. It was a bitterly cold night that brought to a close this 24th day of December. The air outside was still, but the temperature was below zero. Within all was quiet, the servants of Harrowby Hall awaiting with beating hearts the outcome of their master's campaign against his supernatural visitor. The master himself was lying on the bed in the haunted room, clad as has already been indicated, and then the clock clanged out the hour of 12. There was a sudden banging of doors, a blast of cold air swept through the halls, The door leading into the haunted chamber flew open, a splash was heard, and the water ghost was seen standing at the side of the heir of Harrowby, from whose outer dress there streamed rivulets of water, but whose own person, deep down under the various garments he wore, was as dry and as warm as he could have wished. "Ha!" said the young master of Harrowby, "I'm glad to see you." "You are the most original man I've met, if that is true," returned the ghost. "May I ask where did you get that hat?" "Certainly, madam," returned the master courteously. "It is a little portable observatory I had made for just such emergencies as this. But tell me, is it true that you are doomed to follow me about for one mortal hour, to stand where I stand, to sit where I sit?" "That is my delectable fate," returned the lady. "Well, go out on the lake," said the master, starting up. "You can't get rid of me that way," returned the ghost. "The water won't swallow me up. In fact, it will just add to my present bulk." "Nevertheless," said the master firmly, "we will go out on the lake." "But my dear sir," returned the ghost, with a pale reluctance, "it is fearfully cold out there. You will be frozen hard before you've been out 10 minutes. "Oh, no, I'll not," replied the master. "I am very warmly dressed. Come." This last in a tone of command that made the ghost ripple. And they started. They had not gone far before the water ghost showed signs of distress. "You walk too slowly," she said. "I am nearly frozen. My knees are so stiff now I can hardly move. I beseech you to accelerate your step." "I should like to oblige a lady," returned the master courteously, "but my clothes are rather heavy, and 100 yards an hour is about my speed. Indeed, I think we would better sit down here on the snowdrift and talk matters over." Do not do so, I beg," cried the ghost. "Let me move on. I feel myself growing rigid as it is. If we stop here, I shall be frozen stiff." "That, madam," said the master slowly, and seating himself on an ice cake, "that is why I have brought you here. We have been on this spot just 10 minutes. We have 50 more. Take your time about it, madam, but freeze. That is all I ask of you." "I cannot move my right leg now," cried the ghost in despair, "and my overskirt is a solid sheet of ice. Oh, good, kind Mr. Oglethorpe, light a fire and let me go free from these icy fetters." "Never, madam. It cannot be. I have you at last." "Alas!" cried the ghost, a tear trickling down her frozen cheek. "Help me, I beg. I can